Just.
That's great. Thanks.
I want to thank you for having this meeting in English. I think it's so impressive that so much of the world is bilingual. I only speak some English, and that's my first language. So I really appreciate you having this meeting in English for me. And maybe someday we could have part of the meeting in Polish, if I keep hanging out with Tomasz and learning a little bit of Polish at a time. So cześć, PTAstrobio. Let me start by introducing a little bit about my background as a researcher. And I am a mechanical engineer by training and have since worked in biology, a range of things like tissue engineering, so lab-made organs, civic infrastructure for public health, and biological industrial design. But let me try to make this make sense. Why a mechanical engineer
recording in progress
who works with manufacturing of biology is talking to astrobiologists. And so part of the work that Tomasz and I were doing at NASA Ames, and are still doing at NASA Ames, under the direction of the principal investigator, Lynn Rothschild, who's an evolutionary biologist, kind of looks at how you can use biology as technology. And the first step to doing that is to define, well, like what is biology? How is a plant different than a rock? We have to define what biology is so we know how to use it. What are its sensitivities? What does it need to grow? Why is it beneficial to use something that's adaptive and evolving and self-regenerating versus something that's static? So all that starts with a very simple but kind of deep question of how did life begin, the origin of life? And by looking at that point, we can start to understand how life is unique, how it has certain qualities and characteristics that are beneficial for technology, things like it being self-regenerating, it's adaptive, it evolves, it grows. All of those things, if channeled in the right direction, could be very powerful in an industrial design system. So this is not my expertise, but it's absolutely core to really kind of pushing this field forward, this field being biological industrial design. What's another piece of this field? Oh, that is metabolomic engineering, genetic engineering and synthetic biology. That's the set of tools. But this builds on the first characterization of how did life begin, what is life. Now, if we understand what life is, how can we re-engineer it or reverse engineer it towards productive goals? Can we edit the genome to make a bacteria or a yeast produce a target compound, reprogramming the internal logic of the cell to help it work the way we want it to work? So this is a step beyond understanding what life is. Now we're engineering life and doing that using genetics, metabolomics, proteomics, all the omics things. Now we're going to get to the part that I kind of bring to the table, and that's manufacturing. Once we have individual cells programmed to do what we want and we understand how they're working, or as best that we can start bringing them together into three-dimensional forms using bioprinting as one tool of many. And in this way, instead of having the singular effort of one cell producing something or responding to something, now we can start to synchronize and collectively work these organisms together to get emergent mechanical properties, maybe even electrical sensitivity or even producing electrical signals. All of those things we can start to package into products instead of just microbial forms. And this is a lot of the research that I was working on at NASA with Tomasz and other people. And then we come to the very fun kind of final stage. If all of that goes well, if we understand what life is, if we can edit life, if we can have individual cells work constructively together to get emergent mechanical properties, emergent function, organ level function, then are those structures alive? How do we interface our living built structures with other mechanical parts to get things that are regenerative and adaptive and smart part of our built infrastructure? So this is a rough idea about the things that I work on and kind of the little piece that I have in that broader puzzle. But I'm confident that there's people in this room that are experts in these other fields, and I would love the opportunity to get to talk about that further. So all of that was kind of just an introduction to me. So now that we've met, let's dive into kind of what I wanted to talk about today. And that's finding analogs of space at home. And before we get too far, let's make sure that all these terms make sense to everybody. So the first term, finding. I want to find it, but what I want to do is find it together, because the most interesting problems are ones that we can collaborate on. So when I say find, I want to identify an interdisciplinary goal to entice collaboration. What is the common ground? What are questions you have that I have that we both bring our knowledge to that we can answer? Work as a team is what I'm saying. The next question, analog. This is something that people can interpret a variety of ways. The context that I mean is an analog is an approximation. It's a model. It doesn't have to mimic all of the challenges that you have if you were, say, going to go to the moon, or a 3-year mission to Mars, or to some intermittent space travel between the two. The analog can capture some one or several challenges of the space environment as a simulation. And so one of the challenges in space is the isolation. There's not a lot of infrastructure in space. You've got to be very sustainable and self-contained. Another one is the communication lag between your Earth base of operations and whatever your crew is. And that could be anywhere from minutes to hours. So we could include that as part of the analog too. Other things about space that make it challenging, like radiation and weightlessness, those are a little bit more difficult to include in our analog, but there's a lot we can accomplish just looking at things like isolation, sustainability, closed loop wastewater treatment, so we can keep our water potable, all those things. So it's okay to start simple and then get complicated. The next, space. And we talk about space, and I touched on a few of the things that characterize space or off-planet different from on-planet. But the big one is insufficient infrastructure. There's not a lot there to help support us. So we're going to have to figure out how to do a lot of the creating our own power, getting our own potable water, making our own food, all of those things on our own, recycling our own waste. And the last thing is home. And when I say home, I mean actionable, accessible, places that we could go to actually do this research ourselves. And so all this together, I think the point is that necessity is the mother of invention. And so let's challenge ourselves to build and use more sustainable solutions for power, food and water, and waste management ourselves. And then those naturally more efficient systems will be really important when we do think about going to space. So we win whether we stay on Earth, or we win if we go to space. Where do we start? Well, let's begin with what we understand. And we understand, or we have access to, the place that we live, planet Earth. And we know that life is a success story. Life has evolved to exist nearly everywhere on Earth. Almost anywhere that isn't hot lava, you will find something alive or growing there. So let's take a journey back and think about how life got to be such a successful technology here on Earth, and what that might tell us or let us forecast or project into what we would need going forward into space. Let's start with the tree of life. And so here we see some things that are very familiar. We see eukaryotes, prokaryotes, bacteria. We see humans and bear and fungi, all the kind of life that we have found here on Earth. But let's think back to a time earlier in Earth's history when there wasn't so much life on Earth. And when we start to look at the trajectory of how life came to be, we might be able to anticipate what life might need going off the planet. Let's take a stroll back in time to early Earth. So 4 billion years ago, the Earth was a big rock called the geosphere. And this early Earth was a hot place. The surface was fairly unstable. There was a lot of liquid magma on the surface. The atmosphere itself wasn't necessarily conducive to life. It was fairly noxious. And the sun was emitting a considerable amount of radiation. So this was a very hostile, inhospitable place. But as primordial Earth, early Earth, cooled down, as the surface became solid rock and stable liquid water, and the atmosphere became stable too, now we have stability. And instability, the very sensitive process of chemical evolution can begin. And from chemical evolution, on top of that, we saw biological evolution. So the biosphere developed, it's debated, and I'm sure people here know much better than me, anywhere from several 100 million years after the early Earth, the Hadean era of the geosphere, up to much later. But we know absolutely that the biosphere has a long history on the planet Earth and that it's alive and well today. Well, where does the biosphere go? You can see there's more room on the slide. We don't end at the biosphere. This whole tree of life started off at a root, so a very simple beginning life form, and then diversified and grew as it evolved, as the biology was able to grow in different niche environments over time. And eventually, what evolved was human beings. And human beings, along with arguably some animals, started to build the technosphere. And the technosphere is all of the things that we build on top of the biosphere. Our traffic, our roads, our internet, the stock market, the cars we have, the HVAC systems that keep us cooled, this computer system, the internet, that whole technosphere has become a really important part of human evolution and the way that humanity, at least, lives today. And arguably, there are some animals that have contributed to the technosphere or have learned to adapt or evolve within it. So when we look at this trajectory from rock to biosphere to technosphere, when we imagine going off planet Earth, it's going to have to continue to be an evolution of not just the technosphere, but the biosphere, and the relationship between the two that's going to enable us to live on the moon, Mars, or places in between. So this is a picture of a jellyfish. No, I'm just kidding. It's not a jellyfish. This is a picture of one of those technological evolutions, a way that people have left, many people have left the hunter-gatherer lifestyle and moved or evolved into a new way of being with the assistance of technology. This is a picture of, anybody want to guess what this is a picture of? You can say it out loud or you can put it in the chat.
I don't know. Is it New York? Or?
You're close. It is other side of the planet.
Mm-hmm.
This is
Hong Kong.
Tokyo. Very close. Yeah, this is Tokyo. And what you're looking at is an urban center of 37 million people. And there's no way that 37 million people could live off of this land if they were relying on a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And so we can start to consider all of the infrastructure, all of the technological evolution that supports this society. I mean, we can scratch the surface by thinking about all the food systems that they need, the heating and ventilation, the transportation systems, the water systems, the waste management systems. All of this stuff had to evolve right alongside any of biological evolution or any of the existence of people to support this type of lifestyle. All right, let's look at another type of technological evolution or challenge or way that people have built to accommodate their needs. And this is a very different one. This is a refugee city just inside of Jordan, right across from the Syrian border. And today there's about 80,000 people that live there. There's multiple languages spoken. The population fluctuates wildly. There are dozens of schools, many medical clinics that have all been made by the people that live there to satisfy their needs. So here's an example. With very limited resources, people worked together to make the infrastructure they needed to move forward. And so these are two examples, a mega city, which there are many mega cities on planet Earth, and a city that was built by the people that needed it with the resources they had available to them. But we could imagine how people have lived in pretty much on the water, or they've lived in the Arctic region, and the technology that's evolved alongside them to enable to do that. These are all clues and successes we can pull together for when we go to space. So we're not starting from the ground. So a technological evolution will prepare humanity for an evolving Earth and for life off planet. And biology can be part of that technology. As long as we understand biology, we can edit and guide it to the performance we need, and we can do so reproducibly with quality control. So we understand the process and it can become a reliable process. So we've talked enough about Earth. Let's look into space. And although we can't do that quite yet, we could imagine or we could look at what people have depicted or drawn it to be in the future. And so this is a depiction of a possible future, maybe a lunar village. And one thing I want you to notice is how familiar it all looks. These aren't alien technologies. These are things that maybe you have done or you have seen here on Earth. These people aren't eating food out of a Ziploc bag or gruel or oatmeal that we can't tell. They're growing greens growing food. It appears they're using the trees as part of an air purification process to remediate CO2 and produce oxygen as part of a climate control or life support system, which is familiar here too. If there's multiple people, this isn't one person or a crew of 6. This is an endeavor run by a crew, by people who have to also work together. And one thing that analog environments or simulations here on Earth help work out is how to foster teamwork and collaboration in a very confined environment, like a submarine or a sailing trip or something like that. This is also a critical detail because if the team falls apart, if the team doesn't work well together, the entire mission becomes compromised. So all of these important details we have to get a handle on before we could accomplish something like this. One thing I also want to point out is in the upper left-hand corner, you see that those 2 TVs looks like either a monitoring system or a closed circuit surveillance system of some kind. I think this is something that maybe I don't think about enough. And this is the idea of a lunar base being a satellite or sort of like run by a detached operation back down on Earth. I don't think that that's going to be what the future is. I think that the people in these lunar villages are going to want autonomy, and they're not going to want to be surveilled so closely. They're going to want to be able to make the tools they need, grow the food they need, and do so in a safe way, but not necessarily under the thumb of someone else. So let's take a look at another vision for the future of space travel. And this is a depiction from the Chinese Space Agency. Now, this is several decades old, but it also shows a similar theme. One, togetherness. Space is something for people to explore. It's something that children should aspire to. It's something we're all involved in. The importance of bringing biology to space. You can see the pets there, the flowers. This is an extension. It should be a celebration. This is something that people are invited to join in. This isn't just an endeavor for a select few, but it's something we can all aspire to and build together. And then this is not necessarily a vision of the future of space, but it also maybe is an imaginative way of thinking about how our built environment and our grown environment could start to merge. And there are resources to use that would help us do that. Fungus is one of many. The power of biology becomes useful as work. So anything I just said is only possible if we understand biology itself. If we understand it sufficiently to transport it, say, from the ocean or the forest, the natural habitat, if we can understand what it needs, how to keep it alive, how to guide it to those targets that we talked about. Because there are examples of places in the universe where there is no life, like the picture you see the third from the left, like on the moon, Mars, everywhere. We found we found life nowhere but Earth. And in the Petri dish, you have to be able to provide what the biology needs. And if we can automate that and guide that biology, then we can start to get useful work from it and capture all those benefits that biology may offer that other things wouldn't. So how do human missions to space fit into your future? I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 different experiences I had with analog missions. And then maybe we could have a discussion about what might be interesting for analog missions with this group. So the first experience I'm going to talk about was with HI-SPACE, the Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation Mission Site in Hawaii. And this sits on the side of a volcano. It is a dome to house a crew of 6. It generates its own power from solar, from the sun. And if there's no sun or if the battery runs out, you have no power. Water is brought in from a big tank and it fills a reservoir there. And if you run out of water, you run out of water. So it means that you're allowed 8 minutes of showering for 2 weeks. And the food is also brought in from before the mission. And it's pretty much food, a lot of freeze-dried food, pre-packed food. So not a lot of fresh food. And so I went here with 5 other people and we lived here for 2 weeks and simulated a lunar mission. So our communication between this base where we lived and outside was on a delay of several minutes. And if we wanted to go outside, we had to wear a helmet and a jumpsuit and gloves and a sort of a backpack that simulated the kind of support you would need if you were going out on the moon. So it was 2 weeks in Hawaii where I got no sunburn at all. And so that part was welcome. And the rest of it was a very interesting introduction to how much we take for granted and how easy it is to go outside. So some of the research that I did I brought along a 3D printer, and I brought along a tool. And when I got there, I started to think about what do we need now that we're here? What's missing? And how do we use raw materials, the plastics I brought, and this manufacturing device to make our life a little bit easier? Because again, necessity is the mother of invention. So we started playing with different hardware, things that we would want to either repair or replace some of the infrastructure in the habitat. And so we made this wrench, a hinge, and some planetary gears. And the goal here was to make it out of not just a PLA or a plastic filament, but of a blended filament that's part plastic, part bamboo. And this was designed so that you could grow biology through it. And so not only what you made would it be rigid and strong, but over time, maybe it would get stronger. And so one way we tested that, okay, so one step back, is you can see out the window here of the habitat, it's very barren. There's not much out there. A lot of red rock and an old volcano. And so, especially a couple of days in, I got very hungry. I definitely wanted some greens and to finish some greens. All that freeze-dried food was definitely an adjustment for me. And so I made this microgreen farm. And so the cone that you see is for irrigation, and there's small planters. In those planters, I was going to grow chia seeds to prepare some microgreens. And so this is a picture of the chia seeds after they've germinated and grown through. And what we're doing here is helping try to guide and optimize the yield of the microgreen by playing with the architecture of the planter itself. And we found that the chia seeds were really robust and did really well and grew very well in a whole variety of architectures, which means that we can get creative with the size and scale of what we're making. We don't have to just make these small, nearly coin-sized planters. We could maybe make something bigger or larger. And so this is a picture of the microgreen farm with the planters with chia seeds being assembled. We were able to eat and harvest microgreens, and it was a small amount of fresh food. It was appreciated, but love to scale it up. So when we think about scaling it up, instead of making these planters, I thought about making a 3D printed textile. Because another thing about the habitat is horizontal space, shelf space, table space is at a premium. There's not much of it. And so if you want to make a bunch of planters, that's going to take up a lot of space. So I thought if we made something that would hang like a tapestry where we could grow the chia seeds through it, it would yield a lot of chia seeds. It would give us maybe a nice privacy screen to break up the big dome-like habitat. And it would also kind of be maybe partially sort of an air purifier, help regulate the temperature a little bit, and be something nice to look at because it's fairly desolate, like you saw the view out the window. To see something familiar and green might be just emotionally invigorating. So I started playing with making these 3D printed interlocking pieces that could become a hanging textile. And we weren't able to finish this, but I think it would be an interesting project to move forward with now or to think about in the future. And this is a picture of another sort of that 3D printed textile and how it is articulated. And so not just necessarily for a hanging tapestry, but what are other ways we could use this for other things in the habitat, just as another tool in the arsenal of design elements. And the mission that I went on is part of the Sensoria Network. And the Sensoria Network is a group of people, international, anyone's welcome to join. And it's an interdisciplinary group that wants to do missions like this. And so these are 3 patches from 3 different missions. They recently they go to high seas, but they've also been to Linares, which is outside of Pilwa in Poland. And so they also run these 2-week or sometimes longer missions that either simulate lunar or Martian environments. And it's absolutely a network of people that I'm sure would welcome anybody who's interested to start to join these missions and help plan these missions or send research to these missions. The second thing I wanted to talk about is not necessarily a duplicate of space in any way, but it does duplicate the isolation of space and also the need for a crew to bond and get along, and the importance of being sustainable. and mindful of your power consumption, the food that you eat, the water you drink, and the waste you produce. So in 2019, I went down to Antarctica as a guest scientist for Peabody Expeditions, and I spent 2 weeks on the 65-foot ketch-rigged sailboat called the Ocean Tramp. And I went down there for field research, but see a ton of similarities and lessons that the space community and the space analog community can learn from the sailing community. And so this is the program, and they absolutely welcome anybody who has an interesting idea for research in Antarctica or field research down there. So I would encourage you to apply, and if you want to talk about it further, I'm happy to talk about it with you. So this is where I went. I went to the South Shetland Islands, which is just across the Drake Passage from the very tip of South America. And I flew from the Tierra del Fuego, the very tip of South America, across to King George Island, a northern part of the South Shetlands. And from there, that's where I got on the Ocean Tramp and joined the rest of my 8-person crew for our sail. This is a picture from the sailboat of King George Island. There are 3 bases there. One's Chilean, one's Chinese, and one's Russian. And this island actually has the southernmost Russian Orthodox church in the world. And this is a picture, or this is a video of summer, February, in Antarctica. And the temperature was pretty much always 32 degrees. The water was 32, the air was 32. It snowed quite often, and this day was especially sort of foggy. But this was very typical for the 2 weeks that we spent on the boat. And we saw whales and all kinds of wildlife there. But I went to look at the tide pools and to see about the invertebrates living in the tide pools. And so one of the places I looked was off of Enterprise Island. And I would go and take a small sample from the tide pool, bring it back to the sailboat and look at it under the microscope. And what I noticed is not just one organism living in these tide pools, but nearly a dozen different that I could identify with my microscope alone. This was one of the first things that I would see when I would look through, and it was this swarm of cyanobacteria that would be around these kelp or these seaweeds that were also part of the tide pool. One thing I want to mention is that these tide pools, they're very periodic. So they only appear in the summer. In the winter, it is not only too cold, but it's too dark. There's very little sunlight for anything to live. And so these organisms are living in spurts of active phase and then a dormant phase where they pretty much have to wait for it to become favorable again. This oscillation between a dormant phase and an active phase might give us insights into food preservation systems and all kinds of things that would be important to know if we're going on a long space journey where we want to keep our food or keep our materials, sensitive materials especially, protected and safe. The one thing that I was struck by looking through the microscope was the variety of locomotion and the variety of organisms that lived in the tide pool. So we saw the swarming behavior here. Another thing that jumped out were the rotifers. And the rotifers would kind of slide along and search through the petri dish. And in addition to the cyanobacteria and the rotifers, there was amoeba, there was larval stage krill, lots of things. And so what I would like to do is kind of analyze the locomotion of these different organisms and try to find a way to identify the ecosystem in terms of predator-prey relationships and how they move. Because trying to replicate a single organism and use a single organism out of context, I think is going to be difficult. But if we try to replicate the ecosystem itself, that's got to be key to the behavior and even the preservation and resilience of the community. So I was looking for tardigrades and found rotifers and algae and all kinds of insects that lived in the snow. And so coming back to kind of the general point here, there's another term I want to introduce you to, and that's in situ resource utilization. In situ resource utilization, ISRU. And this is a thought in space travel that means that we use what we can while we're there. And I think biology is a great way of trying to grow raw materials or grow things that we can use. And so what does that mean? What does it look like as we move farther and farther from the Earth? The picture you see on the screen is taken from the International Space Station, which is about 220 miles above the surface of the Earth. And this is through the 2-meter wide window in the belly of the ISS, the cupola. And astronauts have said when they look through this window, they see very familiar things. Like here you can see a mountain range. You can see what looks like snow-peaked mountains and cloud weather. This is all very familiar. And the astronauts report feeling a sense of connectedness to Earth and kind of a tether, an umbilical cord, a safety net, because help can come in a matter of hours and resupply also. Let's take a step away. Now, this is a picture of what the Earth looks like from the moon. And it's not quite filling the entire view field anymore. Now we see it as distant. It's a matter of days away. And so the sense of connectedness, the sense of dependence starts to weaken. You could imagine being a citizen of a lunar village and really wanting to be in charge of wanting the autonomy and the ability to make decisions and not be wholly dependent on Earth for everything. Now, the final panel. This is a picture of what Earth looks like standing on the surface of Mars. Again, that feeling of the need to be autonomous, the need to be sustainable, the want to not necessarily depend on Earth for everything becomes even more important as the supply chain gets a little bit farther away. So we need a whole collection of people. I'm an engineer and I'm interested in this, and biologists I think is a critical ally in all of this. But for explorers and farmers, surveys, a whole collection of people are going to have to work together to do this, and we don't have to wait to go to space to start working together. I think you might be familiar with this place.
Mazure.
Yeah, exactly. So this is, I think, an excellent resource in addition to Linares, the analog site outside of Puebla. These are the kinds of places I could imagine really starting to develop technology, studying biology and how we can use biology in analog sites to create, at a minimum, more sustainable technology, more autonomous technology. And if that goes to space, even better. So my question to the group is, can we imagine challenges that get us closer to sustainable food security and living off planet? Like, for example, could a crew of 6 make an aim to produce 20% of their own power for a 2-week mission or field excursion? Maybe food production, so produce 10% of their own food, produce less than a kilogram of waste. But ultimately, it comes down to what the group wants. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts, have any questions, or where you want to start. So thank you very much.